Hello, this is Barry O'Connell, and I'm here with Richard, and he's going to talk to us about the 28 elections. Richard, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful this afternoon. I am ready to talk about the 2028 Democratic presidential primaries and some stuff that I don't think a lot of your listeners or even presidential primary voters would know. So I'm ready to talk.
Fantastic. Let's go.
So, to begin, the Democratic Party has proposed a new system where the four regions of the country, those being East, South, Midwest, and Pacific, those all are going to have a individual state in the process. So give me one moment to bring up the listing. So in the upcoming election, the first states are going to be some combo of the following. New Hampshire and Delaware representing the East, Illinois, Iowa, and Michigan representing the Midwest, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia representing the South, Nevada, and New Mexico representing the West. So in each of those regions, East, Midwest, South, or West, at least one state will be chosen as an early primary state. What does this mean? The traditional primary schedule of Iowa and New Hampshire as the first two states is being upended in this cycle, which is likely, in my opinion, to bode more towards a establishment and or candidate of color rather than a white candidate or a more moderate candidate.
Interesting. Okay.
So in 2020, as we all know, Joe Biden did not do well in Iowa. He did not do well in New Hampshire. He did not do well in Nevada. But in South Carolina, he consolidated the support of most of the Democratic Party, and he was able to become the nominee basically from that South Carolina performance. There is a distinct possibility that in the upcoming cycle, that South Carolina will be the very first state in the presidential primaries.
That certainly would be good to see. I think it's a good test.
Now, as a Maryland Democrat, I believe the most advantageous order would be as follows: Delaware being the first state, South Carolina being the second state, Georgia being the third state, Illinois being the fourth state, and Nevada being the fifth state. That is, I believe, the ideal order for Maryland voters. Maryland did not apply by the deadline to be an early primary state. But I don't believe that's an issue. I just think that Maryland, however, should try to advance in the primary schedule. Maryland votes the same day as New York and several other states pretty late in the process. And as a result, the Maryland Democratic primaries, in effect, only mattered in the 2008 election and in the 1976 election. I could be wrong about that, but I think I would stand on that. Those are the two of the only elections where Maryland, in particular, helped to sway the vote towards the eventual nominee.
That makes sense.
So, what questions do you have about how this new overlay, where Iowa and New Hampshire are not necessarily first, and about how that'll affect this current crop of candidates?
Okay. With the current crop of candidates, why would we push Illinois to the front, and how does that benefit Maryland?
So, one of the Midwest states has to be of the first three. So, it'd be either Illinois, Iowa, or Michigan. Iowa has historically been the first state. Not only has Iowa historically been the first, but it's a caucus state, which, in my opinion, and the opinion of many political observers, is geared more towards the well to do, the politically motivated, college students, retirees, and less towards the electorate overall. Some people prefer this, some people are disinclined towards this. But Iowa is a caucus state, whereas Illinois and Michigan, I believe, are both regular Democratic primaries. Illinois moving forward in the primary process, I think better reflects Illinois is the state that best reflects the United States in demographics, in regional breakdown, it's in urban, rural, suburban divide, etc. Illinois is a very representative state of the United States, and it gives an opportunity early in the process where Black voters are essential, Latino voters are essential, white suburban, rural, and urban voters are essential. There's some progressive voters, there's a lot of moderate voters. Illinois, I think, is just a very representative state. And also, as an homage to President Obama, who came from that state. Michigan is a swing state and Michigan matters. I'm not saying at all that Michigan should be late in the process.
I think we've homaged President Obama enough. Um, just a personal opinion, though he is a truly wonderful person who we should bow and scrape to. Um, I would be inclined to think that the most important of those states would be Michigan. And as a key point of the blue wall, we need to know what candidates can win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And there's almost no one who's even mentioned, even breathed about in the Democratic primary contenders who could screw up Illinois. I mean, that's just our state. We own it. It's almost as blue as Maryland. Um, I'd go to Michigan just to see who's got the pull to go on out and pull a must-win state because that is must-win.
I agree. And in a system where the party deliberately picked on impact, I would agree with you that Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and to some degree New Mexico, Virginia, New Hampshire, and Iowa are probably about the 10 most important, I would say, and should therefore be reflected early. In the upcoming cycle, I believe that Vice President Harris is going to be the nominee, is going to be the presumptive frontrunner, and I think that Illinois being early, it mostly just benefits Maryland on having a similar demographic, not necessarily what you are going towards of Michigan being a swing state that Democrats need to win and where it should be prioritized, which I agree with. I agree with 100%. I'd be a liar to say otherwise.
I would suggest that going with the vice president is a challenging thing to do. She's a coastal candidate who's got a hard line on prosecuting black kids. She's got a lousy record when it comes to that. Um, can she do better in Michigan? I mean, we choked, and Donald Trump is president because we as a party put her up to be our nominee when everybody should have known by that point after 2008, 12, 16, and 20, they should have figured out that we can't win unless we win the blue wall. And we couldn't win the blue wall states with uh, Vice President Harris. I mean, she's the wrong candidate. We're not running a candidate who can appeal to the San Francisco Bay Area over 40 crowd. We need somebody who can appeal to a broad cross section of the voters, especially in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, and fight for some votes there. Just my opinion.
I don't disagree with you. I think the question comes down to how is the campaign run? Bob Brady, the longtime Philadelphia city chairman, gave comments, I believe, the night of the 2024 election that I think some would call overly critical of the Democratic Party and of Vice President Harris, but I found to be rather apt. It looked like to me that in that campaign, much like in the 2016 campaign, the presidential campaign was the driving focus rather than the local, the county, or the state apparatuses that have the relationships that move the voters. That is, in essence, what Bob Brady, the Philadelphia city chairman, said. that they did not have the ability that they wanted to in order to coordinate with the above campaign. And I think that that's a critical part. If the presidential campaign demands to be the front row seat in every single area, to what you're saying, Kamala does not have the roots in Philadelphia that a Bob Brady or that a or darn, what is his name, the former congressman, or that a Shaka Fatah would have had at a point, or a wide variety of other individuals there. If the campaign is run, I'd say last one was more media driven than political in a lot of ways. It was very media driven. It was very directed towards Zooms, towards social events. It was not as much a let's get out and do the door knocking. It was a lot more let's be proud of our candidate. And I think that if that does not change, there could be a repeat regardless of who the candidate is at the top of the ticket.
I suspect that we're going to lose in 28. I'm not feeling good about it. I think, take for instance, when we take a look at Pennsylvania, um, Republicans have the edge in Pennsylvania. We need to win. We need a strong showing in Philadelphia. Now, Obama was able to do it by up in the mid 70% vote turnout. Okay. He got all across the board, from the very young to the very senior, Black vote out strongly. In Philadelphia, he got a good total, not nearly as strongly, but a good total in Pittsburgh. Um, and he did well in this Wilkes-Barre Scranton area and then the Lehigh Valley area. And they cut the totals down in other places. We need somebody who can, the idea that the local candidates are going to carry the presidential campaign in Philadelphia is, I believe, misguided. And if I were speaking to Bob Brady, I'd tell him that to his face. I think this has got to be, we need a candidate who's going to stir up across the board uh, a broad range of ages. I mean, Philadelphia goes on ages, and if the under 30 crowd stays home, we lose. And it's not just presidential, it's gubernatorial, it's all these things. You need a big vote out of Philadelphia to win Pennsylvania because you've got so much red territory. I think it was James Carville who said that it was Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in between. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it is a redneck state to a great extent, um, and we need somebody who's going to stir up the vote. I know you like the vice president, and I like her as a person. I don't feel comfortable with her as a candidate. I'd rather get a real test. If she can't win Michigan in the primary, she should not be the Democratic nominee for president.
I
So
think
I'd
that's a
like to
reason.
get it out of the way.
I think that's a reasonable challenge. I do think that under the current data that I've seen, that if there was a Michigan election, I think that she would win it. To the point that you're making, Kamala is well in the lead among Black voters. She's at 40% or so among Black voters, with roughly a third of Black voters remaining undecided, with Gavin Newsom in second at about 18%, and then after that, a pretty swift fallout. So if she is not the candidate to energize, then I don't know who to say that it is. And even in regards to Governor Moore, Governor Moore did not energize additional turnout, if that's the kind of factor we're looking at. He destroyed Dan Cox. We're not going to argue about that. He utterly destroyed Dan Cox, who was a horrible candidate. But if the measure is increasing turnout, Maryland has seen downsliding turnout through the current governor's candidacy. But to your point, it's not just on having the coordination between the state, the local, and the regional, and the presidentials. It's helpful. It's not just about there being, Josh Shapiro and Wes Moore and Andy Bashir all in Philadelphia arguing their point. There needs to be a very serious, energetic effort And as it looks so far, in part because the vice president has deliberately taken a step back and is assessing her candidacy, I think that is a tactical move because as the front runner, you'd agree with this, every other candidate has reasons to take pot shots at her for this, that, or the other through whatever media means they have. Let's say that you're the current governor in Maryland or the current governor in Pennsylvania. If you don't want her to be the nominee, you're not minding if people give her criticism. So I think it's actually tactical for her to be assessing her candidacy at this moment instead of pushing for it. In fact, the
Oh,
only oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say maybe she needs to spend more time assessing her loss. And maybe we need a little more campaigning and a little less brat. Maybe we need a lot less time showing off in Maryland. She campaigned in Maryland. Hell would anybody campaign in Maryland if you're a Democrat? You know you won the state. You know you won the whole thing. Okay. Why was she campaigning in coastal areas, Democratic areas, stirring up her base when she should have been in to the three states that matter? I mean, I know I go back on that a lot. I would rather go with a nice Jewish candidate like Josh Shapiro. He'd be a good person if he can win Philadelphia big enough. And he does. He has in the past. I wish we had Gretchen Whitmer willing to run. I wish we had people who were. Look, this comes down to uh, we end up with a very narrow slice. We are guaranteed to win a certain number of states. We are
Mm-hmm.
guaranteed to lose a certain number of states. Okay. We know we're going to do it. Alabama is not voting Democratic anytime in the near future. Okay. Mississippi is not going Democratic. I mean, this is not going to happen. And there's no Republican out there who could win Maryland, okay, or Massachusetts or a handful of other states. We know how these are going to run. We're going to come down to the same three battleground states. Um, and if we kid ourselves that if we get all pumped up on the coast and we go Brad and we go $2 billion and we get all this stuff and we just cheer on how wonderful we are instead of paying attention to the battleground Rust Belt states, we're going to lose again. And I don't want to lose again. I hate losing. I hate having a Republican as a president, especially one as bad as Trump. And you know, I don't think Cruz is going to be that much better because he'll be the Republican nominee.
We have a test upcoming this fall to show if Kamala would be able to win Georgia, which is again a swing. I think that Georgia and North Carolina are two that I'm considering swing states as well, where I think that Kamala does better, whereas a Josh Shapiro does not necessarily, because I don't see the appeal for him directly in the same way I do in those states. If Keisha Lance Bottoms is able to be elected governor, where Stacey Abrams had failed twice, I think that along with of course with Ossoff and Warnock both being elected again and again and again, I think that Georgia is a pretty solid winnable state. I think that North Carolina, especially if Roy Cooper is able to be elected to the Senate, is a winnable state. I think that those two are winnable, and then some combo of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, with me probably saying that Wisconsin and Michigan are the easier of the two.
I would suggest that you okay, you're laying out the alternate view to 270, which is the Sun Belt, as they call it,
Uh huh.
uh, the Sun Belt states. Uh, it's not proven yet. It's not as close. It's not something that we know we can win in the current atmosphere. I think we're going to see Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona trending more and more Democratic. I'm not sure we're ready at this point. And if we go off, yeah, I mean, if we go off chasing those states and take our eye off of the big prize, if we ignore, even if we cut back on campaigning in the blue wall states to chase the Sun Belt, which we did 3 years ago, no, 2 years ago, um, that would put us in trouble. Um,
Well, let me go to another one of the early states that I recommended, Nevada. At present, Vice President Harris is leading among Latinos with about 37% and roughly about a third of Latino voters remaining undecided. Nevada is an interesting state because it's heavily Latino, it's heavily union, it is also heavily concentrated specifically around Las Vegas. The effects of COVID and the downturn in the service worker economy and the economy in Vegas related to gambling, as gambling has become a national economy, have helped to make that state more red. Right now, Nevada has a Republican governor. If Nevada is an early state, I think that much like you're saying with Michigan, that Nevada is a very good test of where the party is going. In 2020, Bernie Sanders won Nevada. Progressive voters, union voters. So much like you're saying Michigan needs to be an early state, I would correspond with Nevada needs to be an early state, and I think it's one that will go very well for Vice President Harris. But in the event she does not run, which I think is the scenario you more so want to discuss, in the event that Vice President Harris does not run, Michigan and Nevada are two of the best early states to see the progressive movement, young voters, and voters of color.
God help us from the progressives. We get dragged down the progressive sewer every once in a while where all this excitement over those people. And they come up with their crazy ideas and their forced Medicare, whether you want it or not, plans and all those things. I don't trust those progressives. And the further left they get, the more they worry me. Of course, I'm old and I'm crabby, so I can afford to do that. But let's talk a little bit about the real problem with Nevada. Okay. We as a Democratic Party treat Hispanics like crap. We act like, you know, unwanted guests at a wedding. It's like, well, who are they here for? Who are they here with? Why are they here? Who are those people? We don't treat Hispanic voters with respect. And even in a place like Maryland, okay, we saw where they took in Prince George's County, decided to ignore the Hispanic vote in this specially constructed Hispanic district and run an Indian woman in there because, well, they're all dark skinned. It doesn't make a difference what they are, right? Okay. Or we take a look at District 46 in Baltimore. Okay. It's shaping up almost a third white, about a third black, and we've got a lot of Hispanic voters making up the rest. Nobody bothers to register them. They have extremely low registration because nobody wants to even look at them. We ignore the Hispanics right across the country. Excuse me.
And Nevada being moved forward in the schedule, I believe would be a move to help accommodate that. New Mexico applied to be one of the early states. I think that in New Mexico you would have a majority Latino Democratic primary, which would be rather unique in the country. Might be the only state that meets that index. So New Mexico applied to be an early state. Like I said about Illinois moving forward, Michigan is a very representative swing state. However, in Illinois, you have a large number of Latino voters, particularly in the Chicagoland area. In Maryland, I'm a huge, huge advocate, maybe the biggest advocate there is, of moving Maryland forward in the Democratic primary. And in that case, Montgomery County and the huge I would say mostly Salvadoran Latino population in our state would be a very big prize for a Democratic candidate. Let's imagine that a Chris Van Hollen aimed to run for president. That is a group that Chris Van Hollen could specifically go after and target for voter registration in order to bolster his numbers.
Let me throw out a thought, okay? I would love to see a Hispanic candidate for president, not necessarily to win, but at least to make a showing, or somebody who can attract a Hispanic vote, because right now, from the Democratic Party looks at voter blocks, and they look at black women as their most important voting bloc because of the number of them and the frequency that they vote, that they turn out, the high turnout voters. Black women are high turnout voters. Do you know why black women vote the way they do?
They were the last to be given the right.
Why did they get the right? Think about that a second.
Fought for through the Voting Rights Act primarily.
Jesse Jackson.
Yes, in the
A lot of people
1984. Yep,
think
yep, yep.
a lot of people think that, well, Jesse didn't win. I mean, he made a good showing, but so what? Is it that important? Yes, it's that important. Jesse Jackson is crucial to the
Mm-hmm.
black vote across the United States. When you take a look at Maryland, okay, you can't win. You can't win Maryland statewide without finding a way to get a good vote out of Prince George's County. It's close
Right.
to 1 million voters. It's got more Democrats than any other place. It's got more Democrats than they in Montgomery County. It's got way more Democrats than Baltimore or Baltimore County or any of the big counties. Okay, so when we look at that, okay, and up until 84, there weren't there's there's a huge amount of black voters who were not registered. And then the Jackson campaign came out in 84 and started registering people to vote. Now you see people, um, God bless them, good women especially, people like Senator Benson, who had been a
And
church leader coming out of the churches. Okay, she got involved with the Jackson campaign. It was church leaders, school teachers, and to some extent black activists who got together and did the voter registration drive. Okay, and then in '88 they really tipped the scales in places like uh, uh, Prince George's County, and that became important. We don't have any equivalent. We don't have anybody who's ever given the Hispanic voters much of a reason to register to vote. And if we want to hold off our broad coalition, we need those votes. We need to make sure that places like Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico are solidly Democratic states going into the future by paying attention to them in a presidential campaign. Just my thought.
I agree. Now, to be fair here, Julian Castro ran a pretty solid presidential campaign in 2020, and he focused a lot on policy issues, specifically around immigration, around guns, around healthcare. And I think that he ran an outstanding campaign talking about the issues. But to your point, there's a big difference between being on CNN talking about the future and being on the ground in Nevada or New Mexico or Texas or Colorado, another state with huge Latino population, in any of those states on the ground, registering large numbers of voters and getting people engaged in the process. I agree with you. I think that should be a central focus in the upcoming cycle, particularly now that it is abundantly clear that Trump's Republican Party is not just anti-immigrant, they are fundamentally opposed to the existence of a large number of people who are settled American citizens and want to get rid of them.
I keep hearing about people being pulled over and sometimes even shot or roughed up or thrown in jail because they fit the description that ICE was looking for. Well, the ICE description is, um, you know, somebody who looks like a Hispanic male. I mean, it's sort of the way they used to describe black people. It's just being black was probable cause to pull somebody over. I
And
mean,
and, and while I acknowledge straightforwardly that this is what Donald Trump promised in his presidential campaign the entire time, at his presidential campaign rallies, there was mass deportation now signs. There is a huge difference between what John Q. American visualizes as deporting the bad guys versus, quote, what Trump's administration chooses to administer that like. Huge difference between the two. And the Latino community across the country has now swung very, very, very anti-Republican. Now, does that also mean that they are anti-Trump or anti-next presidential candidate? We will see, because you will agree with this. Latino voters are much more susceptible to inflation than other voters and are much more likely to change their minds based on it.
That will be a critical thing, but um, you, we're at a point where it's still acceptable in Democratic circles not to register, not to register the Hispanic voters. Um, I hate to pick on poor Bill Ferguson, but how could he have a district that's close to a third Hispanic and he doesn't even bother to get out to do any voter registration drives? Why does he treat them like they're lower class citizens? And doesn't that say to them the Democrats don't value you? And
I
that is a
I
real danger.
I have door knocked in O'Donnell Heights. I have door knocked in Patterson Park. There is a burgeoning Latino community in South Baltimore that does not have direct political representation from their community as of yet. The only Latina elected in the city currently is Odette Ramos, who represents the Hopkins area in North Baltimore. So, to what you're saying, it is an issue across the United States where the Democratic Party should focus, and where, unfortunately, the murder of the Voting Rights Act not only affects like black voters in the South primarily, but it will also affect Latino voters mostly in Texas.
We're at a difficult point, and um, I don't think the Democratic Uh, well, I don't think the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, has shown any real interest in building out the party infrastructure. Um, we've we've got that poor, strange fellow who's the national chairman who got there by bribing people with borrowed money and then had to borrow money to pay off those debts. And now we've got a party that doesn't have any money, doesn't have any impetus, and doesn't have any direction. And so we're not doing anything to further um, growing the Democratic Party in a time when we desperately need to grow it. In fact, if we could use the terrible things that Trump has done to Hispanic people through ICE, we should be doing everything we can to register votes across the border states, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and in California, places where we can register voters, register them as Democrat, play off of the opposition they've been feeling from ICE, and build this up. And suddenly, we don't have to rely. See, I keep talking about the blue wall states only because we're in a position where we've allowed the party. The attitude seems to be we've got gays, we've got Jewish voters, we've got blacks. We don't need whites or Christians. We could ignore the white Christians, and that's been enough to get us there as long as we win the blue wall. We need to start paying if we're not going to reach out to more Christian white voters, non-college educated Christian white voters. If we're not willing to reach out to those people, then we need to make up the vote somewhere. And it's obvious that we could do it with Hispanics, which means that if we really set out to do this right, we could uh, take Arizona, New Mexico, and make them blue states, and we could take Texas and make it a possible swing state depending on the year.
I agree, and the redistricting war that kicked off in Texas, when we see the results of those general elections, where I think it is rather possible that they will flip or remain blue or flip blue, that will be a major driver of your theory. I fundamentally agree with you. I think that having the blue wall as the reliant way to get the electoral votes is very risky, particularly when Nevada had historically been a pretty safely blue state, when Georgia should be a safely blue state, when I think that North Carolina, with the right amount of Democratic input, can be. But there's about seven or so states that all matter, And there is no reason why we have not seen active efforts to register voters writ large, talking about the deeply regressive things the Trump administration is doing and getting ready for the presidential primary of whoever the candidates are. And of course, despite how much I love Maryland, that does not mean Maryland needs to be one of the earliest states, but Maryland should be earlier in the process. And I'm going to continue to advocate for just that.
I think Delaware being an early state and South Carolina being an early state is, I mean, if West were to win um, Maryland, it would be almost meaningless. He's the home state governor. I mean, he'd have to
Correct.
win by a huge amount, or else people would say, we'd end up playing the expectation games. Um, on the other hand, if he makes a good showing, top three in Delaware, and wins South Carolina, then suddenly he's a national contender.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big if, but it's
Yeah,
possible.
I absolutely agree. As Huey Long won the first campaign for a woman senator with Hattie Caraway by invading Arkansas, so to speak. And I think that Wes Moore could theoretically get a momentum. The equivalent of the Buttigieg 2020 could be Wes Moore doing very well in Delaware, doing very well in North Carolina, and riding that momentum. If Wes Moore is able to get a lot of Maryland politicians to go to Wilmington, to go to Bethany Beach. I don't know any other towns in Delaware off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but to go to those population centers, and it's in Newark, Delaware, and to try and get a good number of votes. I mean, it's not like there's ever been, probably going back to when Joe Biden first ran for Senate. I don't know if there's ever really been a retail politics campaign in that state. So the sheer amount of Maryland firepower he could bring in could be very, very meaningful.
I think that would be a good state for him. I think, and he doesn't have to win it for it to be important. He just has to do better than expectations.
Yeah.
Nobody
Yep.
is looking for a top three. In fact, even a top five would make him interesting.
Absolutely. Because in most of the polling I've seen, it includes the following names: Vice President Kamala Harris, California Governor Gavin Newsom, former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, Representative Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. And then the fifth one, I've seen Bashir, I've seen Pritzker. But Wes Moore is usually not in that top five layer. If he were to perform well in Delaware, which again I think would be very possible, there are actually no Democrats that border Delaware, but there are some that aren't too far. And if he were to get Baltimore City Democrats and Prince George's Democrats going to Wilmington, we could knock a lot of doors theoretically, and it would be hard for anybody else to get that sort of an army in the state.
Yeah,
And as you so brilliantly wrote about, Wes Moore was in South Carolina Low Country door knocking for Clyburn's candidate.
absolutely. And then on the same trip, he got up to the Midlands and campaigned for another candidate. Then he also did a campaign for the gubernatorial candidate. I mean, he's working hard. And then after he ends up doing some seriously hard work in South Carolina. Then he got over to Georgia and worked with them. So, Wes is getting out there and making a difference. And I think one of the few things the Democratic Party is doing a good job of is using presidential hopefuls to build party.
Yes, yes,
They've
I
screwed up
agree.
so much, but they have been good on that.
And I think that it builds a more collaborative relationship in the party